Chapter 16, The Trust, Part 2. Twilight stared down into her mug. Was there something staring back at her?
"What's up, Twi?"
Rainbow asked, hitting her shoulder with a light punch.
"That cider reciting world secrets or something?"
"It damn well better not be," Flint said from across the table. Twilight looked up to see him narrowing his eyes at her mug like some disappointed uncle. "The brew might reveal the truths of the world, but it ain't supposed to do it till you drunk it."
"Drink,"
Twilight corrected. "What?" Flint cocked a brow.
"The word you meant to use is drink,"
Twilight said.
"Drunk is the past participle conjugation. You should be using the simple past tense form."
"Philly, are you trying to tell me that you've been asleep for 1,000 years and you know my grammar better than me?"
"Well,
Twilight tapped a hoof against her mug, thinking.
actually, that's an interesting question."
Dusty Tome was nodding to himself from where he stood, leaned against the kitchenette counter. He had been reading a book for much of the party, but taken the time to mark his page and close it.
"Language changes over time, after all," he said. "And wouldn't most speakers say that the version they grew up with is what's correct? Meaning that the true version of any language, from a certain perspective, would be the one originally spoken."
Twilight said.
"But then how do you define the exact point when a dialect becomes its own language?" "Stop!"
Startrails jumped in front of Dusty, blocking his view of Twilight.
Stop! By the waves! This is supposed to be a party? You two eggheads get a room if you want to debate grammar or whatever."
Dusty poked his head around her shoulder.
"But we weren't debating." "Not yet, anyways,"
Twilight said.
"Music change."
Rainbow shot out of her seat. She looked around the room.
"Come on, what's another good record? Hey, have you guys got any rock?"
They were all gathered in the combination dining room and kitchen that served as a lounge aboard the Argo. A keg of cider occupied one end of the table, a spigot driven into its side. Hay fries and fresh-baked brownies sat on a plate beside it. Sea Saber fished through a shelf of records before picking out a disc and holding it out to the other Pegasus. Rainbow took it with a nod of thanks, swapping it out for the old record and setting the needle down onto the disc. A quick drum beat filled the room, joined soon after by the rest of the band.
"At risk of starting more of that,"
Applejack began.
"I gotta say, this is some mighty good cider, Flint. Y'all say this is homemade?"
"Damn right." Flint pounded a proud hoof against his chest. "My family's been brewing their own drink since before the waters. It's a drink fit for royalty, which is why we make sure none of the bastards ever get any." He slapped Applejack's shoulder as he laughed, and she let out a little chuckle of her own before lifting her mug to her lips. Twilight passed some time by watching Rainbow dancing in the limited airspace above the table. She couldn't help but tap a hoof along to the rhythm herself. She had the urge to gather her friends together and start up a conga line, just like they used to back in Ponyville at nearly every party Pinkie ever threw. It would seem wrong to do it without the whole group, though. Satisfied that the crisis was averted, Trails relaxed into a seat at the table. She grabbed a brownie and took a bite.
"You know what I've been wondering?"
She began.
"What exactly did you ponies do?" "Huh?"
Rainbow asked, pausing her dance mid-roll. She hung in the air upside down as she cocked her head.
"I mean, look at that!"
Trails said, gesturing at the Pegasus with her brownie.
"How the heck do you hover upside down like that? And you?"
She pointed the brownie at Fluttershy, who shrank back into the corner of the room she'd been sitting in.
"You stared down a sea serpent." "Are you asking what we did for a living?"
Twilight asked.
"Like, our jobs?" "Yeah, that's it."
Trails nodded, brownie crumbs collecting on the table in front of her.
"Were you some kind of beastmaster back in your day, Fluttershy?" Well, I suppose that would be, technically accurate,"
Fluttershy said. She tapped a hoof at her chin.
"Although I don't think my furry friends would like being called beasts, and I never thought of myself as their master. I think animal friend carries a much more accurate connotation,"
Twilight added.
"Yeah, her cottage was a total zoo,"
Rainbow said, righting herself and landing on the table. She scooped up a brownie with one wing.
Not a zoo,
Fluttershy insisted. She hid behind her mane as the group's attention shifted back to her.
That is, zoos aren't very nice. All I did was open up my home to the local woodland critters, really.
Flint narrowed his eyes at her.
And that's how you learned how to stare down sea serpents?
Well, I really only used the stare when someone was being really, really bad.
Fluttershy said.
Celestia knows that chickens would hardly do a thing without it.
Chickens, eh?
Flint leaned back, seemingly losing interest.
Fluttershy, you need to come see me later for bragging lessons,
Rainbow said. She flew over to Flint's side and nudged him with a leg.
She stared down this huge red dragon once.
Dragon? Flint echoed, leaning back in. Rainbow grinned.
Sent the big guy crying home to his mommy with a few stern words.
Fluttershy fidgeted in place. She let out a heavy sigh.
Rainbow, you know I don't like to brag. That's not really bragging, Fluttershy,
Trails said. She gave a few slow shakes of her head, looking down at the last bite of her brownie.
A dragon? You think that's impressive?
Rainbow's chest swelled as she pumped herself up, pounding a hoof against her side.
You ever heard of the legendary Sonic Rainboom?
Dusty frowned.
But you already told us about that. I've heard the story twice, actually,
Trails said, raising a hoof.
So?
Rainbow dropped down into a chair. She looked up, striking a pose.
It's an awesome story every time you hear it.
Hang on.
There was a thud as Flint pushed his mug away and leaned forwards.
You saying you can pull off a Sonic Rainboom?
Trails turned sharply to face him, blinking in surprise.
What? She's told you this story!
First I've heard of it,
he countered. A triumphant grin broke across Rainbow's face. She struck another pose, opening her mouth to begin the story, only for Trails to speak first.
I have personally seen her tell you this story,
the unicorn said, her voice firm.
Bah!
Flint waved her off with a hoof.
Name one time.
On the dive to Ponyville,
Trails said.
She spent 10 minutes on it, and you said it was pretty alright.
Several seconds passed while the two crewmates stared each other down, the skepticism in Flint's eyes meeting the determination in Trails. Twilight looked from one to the other. She slowly levitated a brownie off the table and took a bite.
Wait a minute!
Rainbow's voice cracked when she broke the silence. She flew right up to Flint, sticking her muzzle in his face.
Are you telling me you weren't even listening?
Flint pushed her back with a meaty hoof.
Are you telling me you thought I was?
Of course I did!
Rainbow said. She threw her hooves up with exasperation.
You nodded and made noises that said it was alright and everything.
Dusty cleared his throat, grabbing the mare's attention. For future reference, Rainbow Dash, that means he isn't listening.
Whatever.
Rainbow plopped down into her seat once more. She crossed her hooves, sulking. There was a moment of awkward silence as the record shifted into a new song. A slow jazz rock rhythm filled the room. Twilight finished her brownie.
Damn impressive, though,
Flint said. Rainbow's pout twisted into a little grin.
So what about the rest of you?
Trails asked, her eyes shifting first to Applejack, then Twilight.
We've got Fluttershy the Beastmaster and Rainbow Dash the Speedster. What are your great mythic feats?
Shoot. Applejack screwed her eyes up. She tapped a hoof against the table and thought. To be honest, y'all, I kinda just worked my farm and grew apples. Twilight's the real impressive one. Twilight blushed. She looked down at her drink. Her reflection didn't talk to her.
All I did was read books and cast spells, Applejack.
Come on now, Sugar Cube. He'll did way more than that, Applejack insisted. Fluttershy's soft voice was difficult to make out over the music playing.
There was that time you brainwashed the entire town into fighting over your childhood doll.
The music came to an abrupt stop.
An actual record scratch? Celestia, save me!
Twilight turned to see Sea Saber steadying the phonograph with a hoof. If the normally aloof Pegasus's eyes were any indication, she'd bumped into it in shock. A soft, scraping sound traveled across the little galley as the record spun in place. Twilight lifted the mug to her lips in an attempt to hide the furious blush on her cheeks.
What was his name again?
Fluttershy's innocent voice continued.
Smarty Pants?
Trails slapped a hoof onto the table, a few tears forming in the corners of her eyes as she laughed. When Twilight finally ran out of cider and let her mug down once more, she was faced with Flint staring at her in a strange mixture of confusion and awe. What the fuck? Twilight stared hard at the bottom of her empty mug. She couldn't remember any invisibility spells, but she did know a shrinking spell that would let her crawl into it and hide instead. For the 5th time, Anna followed Pinkie and the Countess out of a clothing shop with empty hooves.
Those fabrics all looked fine to me,
Anna said.
So did the ones at the last store, for that matter. That's what I always say, too,
Pinkie said.
But the clothes I make usually come out all raggedy and pink. What's the word you like to use, Rarity?
Rarity looked up and down the street before picking a direction to start down.
Garish, darling. Garish, that's it.
Pinkie gave a few big nods as she began to bounce after the other mare.
So unless you want a garish culture, you should probably listen to what she says. Rarity really knows her clothes.
Anna blinked.
You make clothes too?
She broke into a trot to catch up with the other 2 mares. Pinkie giggled.
I try sometimes. Proper fabric makes the difference between clothes and art, dears,
The Countess said.
And although I could settle for making clothes, I certainly won't let a bit of walking keep me from art.
She hummed to herself as an airship passed in front of the setting sun, dropping the orange street into its shadow.
And besides, it's been too long since I had the chance to enjoy some proper shopping. I've never considered shopping to be more than a chore,
Anna muttered. The Countess said something in response. It was probably something about introducing Anna to proper shopping or another burst of inspired artistry, but Anna didn't hear it. She was far more focused on the familiar armored stallion approaching from down the street, and the half-dozen ponies flanking him. Anna swept her eyes across the street in search for an exit. If Kick saw them, then things could get complicated. She had no doubt that he would try to grab Pinkie and the Countess right off the street. Worse yet, he might reveal to them Anna's true identity. There were no alleys close enough for escape, no convenient crowds to get lost in or wagons to walk behind. She was short on options.
This place looks pretty good,
Anna said, interrupting something Pinkie was saying about an itch on her knee. She nodded at an unlabeled storefront. If not for the open sign hanging on the door by a single frayed cord, she would have probably thought it was a home.
Oh, is that so?
Rarity asked, eyeing the chipped white paint faded into gray. Anna shrugged, stealing a glance towards Kick. One of his underlings was squinting in their direction.
Buck, I've got a hunch. I thought you liked shopping.
Rarity waved a hoof as she giggled.
Oh, well, I suppose as long as you're getting into the spirit, we might as well give it a try.
Anna didn't waste any time in opening the door. A jingling bell was just barely audible over the din of the crowd. She ushered the mares in as Rarity continued to talk.
Who knows? Maybe it'll turn out... Oh, goodness.
Anna closed the door behind her as she brought up the rear. She turned to scan the room, and found that her excuse of a hunch might turn out to be true after all. Rolls of colored fabric sat on neat rows on angled shelves, weaving through the warm-lit room like a rainbow river. A single, surprised mare watched them from behind the counter, flanked by an array of needles, scissors, knives, and other sewing tools.
Hi there.
The mare behind the counter said, blinking away her shock.
Can I help you? Do you know, I think you just might be the exact mare we've been looking for.
Rarity shot a giddy smile Anna's way, her forehooves bouncing with excitement.
You've got quite the eye, darling.
Anna responded with a brief nod before turning her attention back to the store. It was a cramped affair, the whole thing giving the impression of a larger front squeezed into a small space. There were only 5 shelves, including the 2 on the walls, but each one was wide enough to hold rolls of fabric over a meter long. The tight quarters wouldn't favor her over the burly earth ponies of Kick's squad, but perhaps they hadn't seen her in time. If not, then the question became one of how hard to fight. Anna's view of the door was blocked by a shelf of fabrics ranging from a deep blue to a pale green, but she still stiffened when she heard the jinglings that signaled that the door's opening. Heavy hooves and heavy shoes stepped inside. Hey there, pretty mares.
Oh, good evening, gentle colts. Hiya, guys. Can I help you at all?
Anna the bounty hunter was an experienced close-quarters combatant that, in a tight space, could provide a challenge even for a group of 6 Earth Pony mercenaries. Anna the refugee, however, would be a frightened and helpless thing. If her target saw too much of her true self, she might have to move up her timetable. But perhaps there was a bright side. Her 2 targets were supposedly some of the most powerful gifted to set hoof on dry land in centuries. It was this uncertainty that had kept Anna from ambushing them in a clothing store already. Maybe this was an opportunity to see just how well they could defend themselves. More heavy hooves filed inside. She could hear them spreading out to block the door. The bell jingled one last time as the door was deliberately closed. One of Kick's underlings stepped into sight, looking down her aisle. It was the young one from the bar. His eyes widened as he saw her standing there. He opened his mouth, but all that came out was a strained croak. Anna bared her teeth.
Hey, kid.
Rarity didn't like the look of these stallions. They eyed her and Pinkie with hungry gazes, and they were hardly dressed for an afternoon stroll. Sea Saber had told them that every public appearance painted a new target on their backs, but she'd nearly forgotten the warning by now. A gang of bounty hunters interrupting a nice, relaxing shopping trip was a rather abrupt reminder, she thought. She stood taller, letting the brim of her hat slide back so she could meet the leader's gaze without interruption. She was a countess, after all. The gruff Earth stallion looked at her over top to bottom, his jaw shuffling side to side as if he was chewing something. Pinkie leaned into Rarity's ear, whispering loud enough for the whole room to hear her.
Rarity, he looks hungry. I told you we should have stopped to eat.
Rarity sighed.
And it was shaping up to be such a theatrical moment, too.
I get the idea you know what's going on here, Countess, the stallion said, a laughing grin pulling at the corner of his lips. So why don't you come with us quiet, and we won't have to ruin this nice Philly store.
You have got to be kidding me!
The countermare shouted. Rarity and the stallion both jumped. They turned to watch the young pony slam her hooves into the countertop.
2 months of seeing no pony but the same tired old mares crocheting hats for their grandfoals. Here I thought my luck might be changing, but no! Just bounty hunters coming in to do their business! Ah!
The mare flung her hooves up before stepping out from behind the counter. She stomped past Rarity and Pinkie, even causing the bounty hunters that towered over her to flinch back as she approached.
Just fuck it all then,
the mare shouted.
I'm going out for dinner.
She shoved the lead hunter aside, opening the door and slammed it closed behind her. Her frenzied shouts faded into the distance. Rarity and the lead hunter's eyes met each other's once more. Well, since I suppose that's settled, he said. Hard way or easy way? Pinkie Pie growled at him, her tail twitching. Rarity's heart fluttered in her chest. Was it already time for the beautiful countess to defend herself from a gang of ignoble rogues? She would be lying if she said she wasn't afraid, but she was comforted by her surroundings. Her magic was at its very best when working with fabric. If she was being quite honest, the question at the forefront of her mind just then was which colors she would have to ruin. She flicked her horn to the right, grabbing a roll of cloth off the shelves with her magic. It was a fetching pale blue that she felt would complement Anna's eyes nicely, and if she was going to have to pay for it anyways, then she wanted something she liked. On the other side of the shelf, she caught a brief glimpse of Anna staring down a younger stallion. Rarity had just enough time to feel the chill from the Thestral's glare before she ripped a section from the roll and tossed it at the lead hunter. The stallion sputtered as the cloth tightened around his face, compelled by her magic. Rarity shoved herself into his armored chest with all her strength, and a high-pitched "Oof!" escaped her. She bounced off and landed on her rump. The hunter tore the cloth away from his face with a furious roar, all the more fearsome for the way he glared down at her. He reached out with his thick legs and grabbed her, pressing his weight down onto her back and sending her head flying.
Ugh! Get off of me, you ruffian!
Rarity's eyes scanned the shelves. She spotted a pleasant soft pink that would do well as some contrasting highlights for Anna and flung the entire roll at the stallion. Cloth was soft, but Rarity knew from experience how hard a full roll could hit. The stallion's roar cut off with a yelp as he fell off her, and it only took Rarity 3 quick seconds to wrap his limbs in a gorgeous pink bow that clashed horribly with everything about him. Her heart was pounding so loud that she could barely hear anything. Something nagged at her as she stared at the stallion struggling in vain against his bonds. Hard shoes kicked her in the side, and she collapsed against the adjacent shelf, and she remembered that there was more than one bounty hunter. She lit her horn as she rolled onto her back, spotting her new assailant brandishing the ends of a chain in his hooves. He reared up and slammed his hooves into the shelf on either side of her, and Rarity let out a rising shriek as she, the stallion, and the shelf all fell backwards. A roll of cloth smacked into her horn, shorting out her magic. She tried again, only for the stallion to headbutt her and break her concentration once more.
Sorry, miss,
the stallion growled, grunting as he struggled to pin her legs against her belly.
No magic!
Uncouth barbarian!
Rarity shot back. She clenched her jaws, she pulled her head back and slammed it into his. Her vision burst into stars at the impact, but the weight pressing down on her lightened. Her magic reached out, grabbing the fabrics that had fallen around her and throwing them all in the vague direction of her attacker. Rarity was vaguely aware of Pinkie singing a song somewhere nearby. She sounded happy. There was a great deal of shouting, too, which didn't sound nearly as happy. Rarity's chest heaved as she clambered to her hooves, sucking in a deep breath. At the same time, she saw the chain-bearing stallion tearing himself loose from the pile of heavy cloth she'd thrown onto him. She gasped as one of the fabrics, a hideous off-orange brown, was torn in two by his strength.
No! You monster!
She grabbed the fragments in her magic and wadded them up, using them like bludgeons as she pummeled him.
What am I supposed to do with Fulvis? Fulvis doesn't go with any pony!
The stallion's armor was tough, but it left his face bare to her righteous fury. He flinched back from the power of the onslaught, and her magic transformed the fulvous fists into a set of bindings that matched only with his terrible sense of fashion.
Rarity, look out!
Pinkie's voice cut through the haze. Rarity ducked on instinct, only to be struck squarely in the rear by a heavy object that let out a deep-voiced "Oof!"
Oh!
Rarity bounced into the shelf in front of her, driving it into a ponderous tumble. Fabric rained down on top of her.
Ah! Stop bumping into me, you brutes!
Rarity roared as she burst out of the pile of cloth, her magic gripping each one like fabulous clubs. Her narrowed eyes locked onto the 3 bounty hunters picking themselves up around Pinkie. The other mare watched her with wide eyes, her mouth hanging open. One of the hunters gathered himself enough to toss a punch at Pinkie. Her leg twitched, and she danced out of the way without looking. Her shock at Rarity's outburst gave way to a characteristic giggle snort as the stallion tripped over her tail and landed in a pile of fuchsia cloth.
Mismatched troglodytes!
Rarity let loose with her rainbow arsenal. The remaining bounty hunters were helpless against the sheer mass of attacks that came at them. They could each dodge a few swings and absorb a couple blows, but they only lasted seconds before falling to the floor and covering their heads with their hooves. The pale glow of Rarity's magic cast dark shadows over their faces as their legs were bound with elaborate knots. Rarity could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She stood with legs spread wide in the middle of the store, surrounded by the chaos of broken shelving and unrolled cloth.
Wow, Rarity!
Pinkie chirped.
You really let loose!
Rarity took a deep breath.
A lady must not lose her temper!
Slowly, she released her grip on her textile weaponry. She closed her eyes and cleared her throat, and pushed out a polite,
Apologies, darling. Sometimes the situation just gets the better of me.
A wooden creaking came from behind her. Rarity's calming pulse accelerated once more as she twirled about, grabbing a roll of cherry red cloth in her magic. The last standing shelf groaned as it fell over. A wide-eyed Anna stared at the 2 gifted mares. A young bounty hunter rolled on the ground at her hooves, groaning. The rage left Rarity in an instant. She dropped her bludgeon and rushed to the poor refugee's side, all her anger forgotten in the wake of fresh concern.
Goodness, dear, are you all right? Did he hurt you?
Anna blinked. She looked down to the groaning young hunter.
I'm fine, Auntie.
She met the Countess's eyes once more and gave her a weak grin.
Got lucky, I guess. Lucky I didn't try to take the 2 of you on myself, that is.
The inexperienced bounty hunter had been taken care of in seconds. Anna had spent the last minute just watching her targets do an admirable job of defending themselves.
By Luna, that mare is a weapon.
On one hoof, the Countess certainly didn't come off as a threat when she was busy prancing through clothing stores or recoiling at every mote of dust that drifted into view. But on the other, Anna had just watched her swing a roll of soft cloth hard enough to knock down a muscled earth pony. And she could swing a lot of them.
And the price on those heads will only go up once word gets out what they did here. Well, I'm certainly glad to hear it,
Rarity said. She glared down at the young stallion on the floor. Her horn glowed, and some pieces of weird brown-orange cloth floated over to wrap his legs up. The mare held herself as if she were wrapping him with a rope that she had pulled out of a sewer. Anna looked over to Pinkie, who gave her a friendly wave. She hadn't been able to see the bouncy gifted for most of the fight, but she had seen how easily she dodged that punch, without even looking even. There wasn't a single scratch on her bright pink coat.
Can we go eat now?
Pinkie asked.
I've really worked up an appetite. Just hold on a bit longer, dear,
Rarity said, waving a hoof at Pinkie as she began to pick through the chaos of the shop.
I saw a few good colors during the fight, and I want to get them while I'm here.
She paused, glancing at the door.
And we really should find that nice shopkeeper too. I'll have to compensate her for all the trouble.
For a brief moment, Anna was struck with a powerful urge to run.
These mares are dangerous. You're out of your league.
She held herself firm, pushing the doubts down. She had hunted dangerous ponies before. With enough time to plan and observe, any obstacle could be overcome. It was just a matter of time and resources. And she believed that she had just earned some very valuable trust.